Hello, and thank you for taking the time to review this recording, a guide to data protection and GDPR. For those of you that don't know, GDPR is the General Data Protection Regulations, which is coming into effect across Europe in May 2018. So depending on when you're watching this, it either has done or is about to be launched. Essentially, it goes hand in hand with the Data Protection Act of 1998, but it goes further as well. So a kind of a theme through this short presentation is if we are complying with our Data Protection Regulations Act, we are doing probably a pretty good job with GDPR, but I do want to highlight some changes. And for those of you that are affected by GDPR on a daily basis because of the role that you play within CSR Group, it's really to highlight what it is. And there are some principles that go along with it. I'll try and make this as short and brief as I can, but the ultimate aim is to give you more information and a better idea of what the GDPR regulations are all about. So first of all, I just wanted to mention data breach and what it is. We're hearing a lot about it at the moment, and GDPR and data protection is all about data breaches. And this is the intentional or unintentional release of secure or personal sensitive information to an untrusted environment. The reason I've put Mark Zuckerberg in there is well, he's in the news a lot. He's in the news a lot anyway, but particularly at the moment because of a huge data breach within Facebook, which is being called a data breach. It's affected over 87 million users of the tool, and it's where information has been shared with an organisation known as Cambridge Analytica, which have potentially been using that information to influence voting in general elections. So Mark Zuckerberg has been a little bit contrite, has apologized. He doesn't look quite that contrite in that image, but had to apologize in front of many people live on television, and is being well, embarrassed really. And the reputation of Facebook has been damaged, perhaps for all time, by this particular interaction with a third-party agency. So in that data breach definition, it talks about personal and sensitive personal information. And what is that? Well, simply put, the Data Protection Act tells us that personal information is any data which relates to a living individual. So anything can be personal data that actually will allow that individual to be identified. And sensitive personal information is further information about that individual, not just that it identifies them, but it identifies something personal about them. So they're similar, but not exactly the same in terms of how they're defined. So the categories of personal data, of sensitive data within the Data Protection Act, the stuff that doesn't just identify somebody, and there's a number of them, are these. So racial or ethnic origin, memberships of trade unions, physical or mental health or conditions that an individual would have. And I've picked out obviously there the information which we may or may not have. There's certain information on this list we just don't have, and we wouldn't want to have because we don't need it. But that's the kind of thing that we're looking at. And we clearly hold information within the office, although it is secure and restricted, about safeguarding. And although that's something which is almost unusual for us, that we would not be able to share information amongst ourselves, it's very important that we do restrict that information, because that's part of the regulations. People who don't need to be a part of or have certain types of information shouldn't have access to it, and that's really important for us. So the data protection processes, and how we can live up to it. What are the problems if we're not doing things in the right way, particularly if you're in the front line of it because you're dealing with information, particularly from enrolment paperwork perspectives. Well, the benefits of doing it right essentially are that it's going to help us to comply with those legal obligations that we have. It should save us a bit of time and money if we're complying with particularly elements of GDPR, which I'll come on to. And it helps us to have a good relationship with our employers and our learners, and they'll have more trust within what we do and who we are as an organization. The flip side of that is, if we do get it wrong, how do we inform people that there has been a breach? That's something we really need to be clear on. If we suspect a breach, we have a process to follow, and that we do follow it. But also the impact of not doing a good job around data and data protection, the financial and reputational costs to us as an organization, and we could have financial penalties in place upon us, and that would be probably from the Information Commissioner's Office, the ICO, which I believe could go up to, or commonly up to, about £500,000. And also there's going to be a loss of reputation with audits and problems with audits, and potentially we could have accreditation removed from us as an organization. So anyone who processes, has access to personal information, must comply with the principles. And there are 8 of these principles in the Data Protection Act. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I'm going to pick out a few that I think definitely apply a lot to us. And it's that it must be fairly and lawfully processed, that we're not giving information out to any third parties that don't need it. It must be processed, the information that we have, the personal data, for a limited purposes only. And we only collect the information that we're asked to, that we are obliged to by the Education and Skills Funding Agency or awarding organisations or Ofsted. And really that's who informs us of what we need to keep and what we need to store. Principle 3 on there at the top in blue: personal information must be adequate, relevant and not excessive. I'm going to come back to that in one of the slides in a moment. Principle 6, personal information must be processed in line with the subject's rights. That again, GDPR, we'll have a look at that. And it must be secure, number 7. Now, they're all important, but obviously those are the ones that I like to highlight. In terms of GDPR then, these are 7 or so principles for GDPR, and I'm going to go into these in a little bit more detail. Firstly, it must be quite transparent. Why are we asking for the information that we are asking from the learner? Now, they have to fill that information out in enrolment. Do they know how it's going to be used, how it's going to be stored? And that, I think, is something which we can make sure that they have very easily. It must be done in a transparent manner, essentially. They must have full awareness and disclosure about why we're asking the questions and what they're for. The second principle, it must be processed for limited purposes. That is, for us, very straightforward. We do not ask or require for any information that we do not specifically need in order to carry out our duties as a provider in the apprenticeship arena. So, you know, that's something which is fairly straightforward for us. The GDPR regulations do seek to regulate the amount of data we collect about any individual or an organization, the quality, accuracy of it, how good is it, if we're going to keep it, is it right, and then how long is it kept for. So those are the things that are important into that second principle. And this goes on a little bit further. So this bit about adequacy and relevance and not being too excessive, and that's the Goldilocks principle. At least that's what I'm calling it anyway. So the information must be adequate. We've got to live up to those requirements of the information that is expected. It must be relevant to that individual. We're not asking about things that we don't need to, but it must be up to date and accurate in that relevance, and then not excessive. I guess the problem of having too much information is it could be an invasion of privacy. Why are you asking those questions about somebody or about me if you don't need to know it? So we don't do that, and that's clear. But that's one way, at least, we definitively live up to this principle. And obviously, not having enough information could mean bad decisions are made. That we're not seeing somebody who's not eligible until it's too late, until after they've started, or even as far as they've completed already, but they weren't eligible. So we need to make sure that we've got everything that we do need, and we're audited enough to know that we can live up to the third principle quite fairly. Fourth principle, data will be inaccurate if it is incorrect or misleading into any of the facts that we hold. any of those fields, if any of them are wrong, then the data in its entirety is inaccurate. So we must keep it up to date. We're already doing this. Great. Fourth principle, big tick. 12-week reviews. We have a statement in there. If the learner's details have changed over the last 12 weeks, please update them here. So that's something that is already part of our processes, which is great. We don't always have to have everything absolutely complete. So data, personal data and personal sensitive data could be CVs. Somebody, that has gone through the process to become a learner and get access to a program, we may have their CV. It may say on their CV that they've got certain qualifications. And if those qualifications are important for their eligibility for a program, we need to do everything we can to check that that is accurate. If, however, they've said that they had a summer job working in a restaurant 2 years ago, we don't need to go back and make sure that that's correct. That's okay. So as long as it's not crucial or important, in inverted commas, that's okay. So it doesn't apply to every last little bit of data that we might hold. Fifth principle, we don't keep data for any longer than necessary. We have a policy in place that states that we will remove data and personal sensitive data 3 months after completion, or the end point. It might not be successful completion, but after they've completed or finished their program at any point. And I think that is an adequate response to our data storage. We can keep statistical data still. It doesn't affect that. We don't have to wipe them from the earth and scorch all information if we've got information about their age, if we've got information about their sex, their race that we need to keep for statistical purposes or would like to, then that's okay. Because inside that there is no personal information. Who was 18? Who was 24? We won't have that. So at the moment, our policy will state how we delete information, when we delete information, who's responsible for deleting it. So we have statutory requirements for keeping information. That really comes from I suppose, industry guidelines. We've got Ofsted, we've got the ESFA. Actually, GDPR doesn't state exactly how long is too long. It is up to us in terms of these bullet points. If it adds value to us, we could keep it for longer, but we'd have to prove that it adds value to our processes for us to do the best that we can in that situation. It will add risk if we keep it for too long. And of course, if we are keeping data for longer than 3 months, how are we making sure that it's accurate? And I think we could probably argue that we can't. So it needs to go. Other retention things, moving on from there is essentially, yes, I mentioned that we could keep some for statistical purposes. So the sixth principle, personal data must be processed in line with the subject's rights. So this is quite an interesting one. In terms of GDPR, individuals have a right to access their data at any point. If we are going to keep it, then they can request to see it. And that's something that we have to comply by. So the individual has a right to know who will see and use their personal data. They have the right to know why their data is being collected and what it will be used for, and to have copies of all of their personal data that is being processed and held. The copies won't be the originals. We don't have to give those, but we do, if requested, need to give them copies of the originals so they can have that. And we have a particular timeline in order to do that, which is 40 days to be compliant. So the rights for individuals under GDPR is that they get access, they have any inaccuracies corrected, information deleted when they leave, along with our guidelines and policy, that they aren't directly marketed, or they're not put into some kind of computer algorithm for profit making or decision making, and that their data is not kept and made portable to other outside agencies. So for us, we need to meet the statutory timescales. We need to have a procedure for that and accountability, and we must be able to disclose the file content in its completeness. If subject asks for their information, they must do so in writing. We must ask or must have proof of identity. I mean, that sounds fairly obvious, but if somebody's going to request it and we get a letter through, please send it to this address, we would, I'm sure, ask for proof of identity and validate that first. We can charge an admin fee. I wouldn't get too excited, probably about £10. It could go up to 50, but I don't think we carry that much information that would justify such a large admin fee. And we can go back and clarify exactly the details of the request inside those 40 days, as long as we're not extending it outside of that. Okay, the last principle must be secure. We must keep things safe. So the personal data from somebody must be processed in a manner that is secure as much as can be appropriate. So we do limit access, as you know, to the data that we store, both hard copy and soft copy, that we have password protection on spreadsheets and electronic files, so that not everybody in the organization can access it. It's only the people that need to access it, and that is kept to the minimum. And there are other processes that we would put in place, that we have put in place, that protect us further. So why does it matter? Essentially, why is it important? Well, clearly it's important because of the new regulations, and we can't fall foul of those. So, if we start to lose data, then we might find it difficult to claim for people. We might be processing people that are ineligible. We might fail audits. We might lose sensitive data. It might be disclosed to outside agencies, which could have very serious implications to the individual and to us as an organization. We need to be able to have our finger on the right information, so that if it is requested, for example, an emergency situation, we can give that accurate, up-to-date information, and that might be in order to keep somebody safe, for example. And obviously, if we're not doing what we should, we can be fined. We can have sanctions put against us. We will lose reputation, and we will have problems operating in the marketplace that we're in. So I mentioned at the start, there are links between data protection and GDPR, and usually and mostly by doing one, it's fine. We are also complying with the other, but if we breach one, we will probably breach the other. So I just wanted to make you aware of those principles of GDPR, so you know what it is. It's not just 4 letters that keeps getting banded around in documents and in the office. And it's about the quality standards that we have for personal data. And that we will comply with those and make sure that we understand what we must do and what we shouldn't do. Okay, so it might be for some that you're looking at new policies and new procedures, and it might be for some that we're changing the way that we work. Okay, thank you very much.